A report from the Washington Post this morning was an effective announcement that the Biden administration has ended the U.S. alliance with Israel. I'll have all the details coming up on In Focus. This morning, we woke up here in Israel to an incredible headline from the Washington Post that only got better as you got into the story. Today, I just want to walk you through the article that is titled, U.S. Arab Nations Plan for Post-War Gaza Timeline for Palestinian State. I want to walk you through this article, really paragraph by paragraph, to explain what's happening here. This is clearly an article that is sourced to the administration. So let me just start right now with the title. Again, U.S. Arab Nations Plan for Post-War Gaza Timeline for Palestinian State. So here we are, yoo-hoo, Israel here, right? We also have a say in this. You know, like we were invaded on October 7th from Gaza. They came in to Israel and they slaughtered us, right? They invaded our communities. They invaded our military bases at 6:30 in the morning, and they went on a murder spree, a rape spree, a mutilation spree, a torture spree, a spree of sadism, the likes of which humanity has not seen, right? In I don't know how long, certainly not in memory, not in recent or distant memory. This is what they did to us on October 7th. But here is the United States meeting with Arab nations to plan for post-war Gaza and a timeline for a Palestinian state. So first of all, hello, Israel here. So now let me just start with the text, okay? Here's the first paragraph. The Biden administration and a small group of Middle Eastern partners are rushing to complete a detailed, comprehensive plan for long-term peace between Israel and Palestinians, including a firm timeline for the establishment of a Palestinian state that could be announced as early as the next several weeks. So first of all, why are they rushing? What's the rush? Who needs to rush? Israel embarked on a peace process with the Palestinians in 1993. And everybody knew, even though it was unstated, that the goal of that peace process was supposed to be the establishment of a Palestinian state. And yet, that was 31 years ago, and there hasn't been a Palestinian state established, at least not formally. Of course, Gaza was operating as an independent state since Israel withdrew from Gaza in 2005. But all the same, we never reached a final status agreement with the Palestinians, not for lack of trying on Israel's part. We offered them, I think, 3 different offers. The United States offered them an offer, and they never even responded. They just walked away and started terror wars each time. So the reason there's no Palestinian state is because the Palestinians never wanted one, right? And the Arabs lived fine with that all of these years. The Palestinians obviously lived fine with that all these years. Israel lived fine with that all these years. So why are they rushing? Well, we don't know. But here they say in this next paragraph, the urgency of the effort is tied directly to a proposed pause in the fighting and release of hostages held in Gaza by Hamas that is being negotiated by the United States, Qatar, and Egypt. So the urgency is the hostages. Why? Because you're concerned about the welfare of the hostages? Is that why? Is that why it's urgent? Because you think that's the only way to get them out is to establish a comprehensive peace? It's not at all clear. It doesn't make sense. There's no direct line of logic between to complete a detailed, comprehensive plan for long-term peace between Israel and the Palestinians, including a firm timeline for the establishment of a Palestinian state and getting the hostages released. One is something that could be done today, and the other one is something that we've been trying to work on for 31 years. And so why is the one related to the other? Well, they're not really, but the rush, somebody's feeling rushed. Who is it? So here they say, so by the way, so who thinks that it's rushed? Well, the answer, of course, is not the Arabs and certainly not Israel. It's Biden. Biden is rushed. Why is President Biden rushed to put out a comprehensive plan for long-term peace between Israel and the Palestinians, including a firm timeline for the establishment of a Palestinian state that could be announced as early as the next several weeks. Well, Biden is rushed because Biden has Michigan on his mind, because he has the progressive base of the Democratic Party on his mind, because he has re-election on his mind, and all of these things require him, as far as he's concerned, to leave Israel out of all of the negotiations, not consider Israel's interests at all, and establish a Palestinian state as quickly as possible, because that's why it's urgent. It's urgent because Biden feels urgency in this issue, and he wants a Palestinian state. It's not the Arabs. It's not the Palestinian Arabs. It's not the Israelis. It is the Americans who are feeling an urgency here. I think that we have to understand. And then they say, essentially, they go through and they explain that what's supposed to happen in the hostages for terrorist swap is that Israel is supposed to agree to a ceasefire. And they're trying to work out the terms of a ceasefire. But the ceasefire, President Biden said, would last at least 6 weeks. And what are they going to do? Why do they need a ceasefire? Why do they need a ceasefire? It says it would provide time to make the plan public. That is the peace plan public, and the Palestinian state peace plan public. Recruit additional support and take initial steps towards its implementation, including the formation of an interim Palestinian government. And planners hope that the hostage agreement can be reached before the beginning of Ramadan, the month of Muslim fasting that begins March 10th, lest it compound the deprivation and pressure cooker atmosphere in Gaza. Yes, because we know, holidays have to be observed, just as the Palestinians observed Simchat Torah by invading Israel. But yeah, we have to worry about their religious sensitivities with Ramadan because they do that, and give them a state, right? So, but here I just want to stop on the issue of including the formation of an interim Palestinian government. So the Palestinian government that they want to form is supposed to be, as I discussed in my previous podcast, it's supposed to be a government of technocrats, of professionals, as in professional terrorists who wear suits as opposed to jalabias or whatever, and without suicide belts strapped to their waist. So that's the idea, is that you're getting technocrats. You're getting people who hide behind desks and finance terror and incite terror and enable terror and train others to carry out terror attacks or acts of genocide, really, as we saw on October 7th. And they're the ones who are supposed to be in charge. And how do we know this? We know this because Mahmoud Abbas, the Palestinian Authority chair, flew to Doha last week and met with Hamas leaders and Qatari leaders, of course, being Hamas's state sponsors. And so they all met together and they agreed on the formation of a unity government that would be technocratic, that would include both Hamas members and Fatah members. So that's what they're talking about. The interim Palestinian government would be a Hamas-controlled government, all right? Just to be very clear, and that's what they want to form. It's just that the Hamas members would be wearing suits and would be frontmen for all the people sitting in the tunnels. So that's the thing. And here they say, says one U.S. official speaking to the Washington Post, said, the key is the hostage deal. And what could derail the hostage deals? That's in the next paragraph. Even as planning participants, and who are the planning participants? Remember, Israel is not involved. It's Egypt, Jordan, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and Palestinian representatives, in addition to the United States, work to reach an agreement among themselves. So they're all planning it with no Israel. It's the Palestinians, that is Fatah Hamas. It is Qatar, which is their state sponsor. And it is Jordan, which just called Israel a 70-year occupation while standing next to President Biden at the White House, meaning that Israel is illegitimate, and Egypt and Saudi Arabia and the UAE. So all of them are sitting together talking about this deal, and Israel isn't there because why? The biggest threat to this plan is Israel, and specifically Israel's planned imminent operation to seize control over Rafah, the border town that borders Egypt. Because the fact is, as Prime Minister Netanyahu said in a couple of interviews over the weekend, right, you can't win this war without taking Rafah. is if you don't take Rafah, Hamas remains in charge of territory, any territory, which means that their regime is maintained. And here, the most important territory because it controls the border with Egypt. So we're talking about not only retaining the Hamas regime, but retaining Hamas's ability to regroup, to rearm, to reorganize its forces because it controls the international border, which means it controls the supply of goods and services into Gaza and arms, of course, and whatever else they want to bring in. So obviously, Israel needs to control Rafah in order to win the war. And so now everybody is piling on to block Israel from taking charge of Rafah. I talked last podcast about the fact that the chief prosecutor, a guy named Karim Khan, at the International Criminal Court said that he's watching very closely because we're going to carry out war crimes if we operate in Rafah. And so everybody is trying to block Israel from operating in Rafah. And then they say here, right, the big problem is the guy that isn't involved, which is the state of Israel. Here they say, the next paragraph, the elephant in the planning room is Israel, and whether its government will acquiesce to much of what is being discussed, the withdrawal of many, if not all, settler communities on the West Bank. Settler communities being Israeli communities, right? Places where Israelis live, 500,000 actually Israelis live, almost 600,000 actually in last count. Israelis live in Judea and Samaria, and it's not just settler communities in the West Bank, a Palestinian capital in East Jerusalem, so that would also require, right, the destruction of Israeli communities, Israeli neighborhoods in our capital city of Jerusalem, where you're going to have another 350,000 Jews that you want to throw out of French Hill neighborhood and all the rest of them, and the reconstruction of Gaza. So let's give them new buildings, right? Because all of their old buildings were crushed because they had subterranean tunnels underneath them that were being used by Hamas as its war machine with the full knowledge of the people who lived on top of them, right? So let's rebuild Gaza for the Palestinians. Let's give them a state. Let's take away Israel's heartland. Let's throw hundreds of thousands of Jews out of their homes, give their land, give their homes to people who just created, who have organized a society around the concept of annihilating all of them. And let's block Israel from winning in Gaza by preventing it from operating in Rafah, right, and taking control of Rafah, which is what is required in order to win the war, right? Let's do all of these things in order to build this detailed, comprehensive plan for long-term peace between Israel and the Palestinians, including a firm timeline for the establishment of a Palestinian state that could be announced as early as the next several weeks. So we're talking about building a terrorist state controlled by terrorists that will be an existential threat to Israel. And in order to enable this to happen, Israel has to lose the war, and Israel has to be willing to expel hundreds of thousands of Israelis from their homes and communities because we have to give them a state, because it's got to be comprehensive, because da-da-da-da-da, right? So that's that. And then what's going to be the thing that convinces us to do this brilliant thing? The hope is that Israel would also be offered specific security guarantees and normalization with Saudi Arabia and other Arab states that would be hard to refuse. So they're saying, destroy yourself, commit suicide, right? Set the conditions for your annihilation. And we know exactly how it would look because we got a pretty big taste of it on October 7th. They're saying, prepare for that. Enable that, right? And then we're going to give you security guarantees. The people who are endangering the existence of Israel, we're supposed to trust them with security guarantees. Oh, nice. And we'll get normalization with the Saudis. You know, this reminds me, in 2002, Tom Friedman put out what he claimed was the Saudi peace offer. So the Saudi peace offer was reduce yourself to the 1949 armistice lines, including withdrawing from unified Jerusalem, all of Judea and Samaria, and Gaza. Allow millions of foreign-born hostile Arabs to enter into your truncated rump Jewish state, right, as part of the right of return of so-called Palestinian refugees to the land of Israel. So be inundated by millions of hostile Arabs, right? And then after you do that, we'll make peace with you. So the idea of the Saudi plan was Israel can commit suicide, and after Israel commits suicide, Saudi Arabia will normalize relations with Israel. So we were on the brink of actual normalization of Israeli-Saudi ties, and now we're back to the 2002 peace offer, which was suicide for peace, right? Not land for peace anymore. We're way beyond that. National suicide, and we'll give you peace afterwards. And that's really the offer for Saudi normalization that's on the table at this time, according to the Washington Post, based on U.S. officials' statements to them. Nice. So, and the big problem is that Israel isn't willing to accept this fabulous offer. Says here, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, he's the bad guy, he's the elephant, right? Has given no indication that he is ready to budge on either Hamas demands for a hostage deal or his opposition to a Palestinian state, because he isn't crazy. I mean, it's just like, whatever. And so here they quote Netanyahu from ABC's This Week. He said, everybody talks about a two-state solution. Well, I ask, what do you mean by that? Should the Palestinians have an army? Should they continue to educate their children for terrorism and annihilation? Of course, I say, of course not. The most important power that has to remain in Israel's hand, he said, is overriding security control in the area west of the Jordan River. Well, duh, right? But what's funny is then they have later on, I'll get to it, they have all of these commentaries. And I think that the most important commentary right now is just Aaron David Miller, the failed American peace processor, and he says here that Netanyahu and Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas, quote, are more interested in keeping their seats than in transforming the region. So I don't know, maybe Netanyahu is interested in keeping his seats. Probably he is. Most politicians don't want to be ousted from office. But this isn't just Netanyahu who doesn't want to commit suicide. This is all of Israelis. You know, and this over 85% of Israelis say they oppose a Palestinian state. This is not something, you know, this didn't used to be the case. You know, on October 6th, you would have probably got a different result. But after we saw what awaits us from a state, because after all, there's been a Palestinian state de facto in Gaza since 2005 when Israel left and Hamas took over in 2007 and turned it into Afghanistan. So we know what happens. And then you say, wait, but we're talking about a reformed Palestinian Authority. Oh, it'll all be different. It'll all be different, right? So let's just go, we can switch forward and maybe we'll go back afterwards. So going forward, let's look. So they're talking about, well, what would be this reformed Palestinian Authority? So first of all right, I'll come back to that. It says here that the Arab officials who are in charge of bringing the Palestinians into line, they say they are optimistic about bringing Palestinian groups, that's terrorist groups, that's Hamas, that's Fatah, these are terrorist organizations, together to establish a government of technocrats rather than politicians, right? Because you know, you wouldn't want, because, I mean, really, politicians. It's better to have technocrats because they understand how to make bombs better because they got that technical knowledge, right? Anyway, so to establish a government of technocrats rather than politicians that would focus on revitalizing the Palestinian economy, improving ownership over security, and rebuilding Gaza, followed by elections. What is ownership over security? That's such a stupid concept. I don't even know what ownership over security means, but I guess it means, you know, you want everybody in one army. So you want Hamas, Fatah, Islamic Jihad, together with all of the official Palestinian Authority security forces that work with them anyway. You want them integrated into units, and then you have, like, what did they call it? Ownership of security. They're all in it together. They're all wearing the same uniforms, right? Because they all share the goal of carrying out October 7th on a mass scale. So they're going to have ownership and they're going to care about their property, right? Because whatever. Anyway, we've never seen any evidence that there's such a thing as economic peace. You know, Gazans got more money than, you know, anybody around them in the Arab world, and yet look what they did, right? They built 400 miles of subterranean tunnels for their war machine. So whatever. Revitalizing the Palestinian economy, that's key, right? Improving ownership over security and rebuilding Gaza, followed by elections. And who would be elected? Well, we know that too, right? Because since 2006 on, Hamas has won every opinion poll, right? Hamas won the elections back then. And since then, they've led Fatah in every opinion poll. And in the latest poll since October 7th, they receive, you know, 85% of the votes. And Fatah, the Palestinian Authority, gets, you know, like 10%. So they're going to have elections and Hamas is going to win. But whatever. Then it says that Mahmoud Abbas, has agreed in principle, several Arab officials said, and could perhaps retain his position as head of state in a role similar to that of Israeli President Isaac Herzog. Well, that's what they said about Arafat in 2004 when they forced him to accept Abbas as his prime minister. And then they said that about Abbas when they forced Salam Fayyad to be his prime minister a couple of years later. And now they're saying it's going to happen again. It's never happened, and it won't happen now. And anyway, who cares? They all share the same strategic goal of annihilating the Jewish people. Certainly his partners in Hamas will. And it says here, participants in the talks are putting forward their favored candidates to serve in other top government roles and debating whether Hamas's political leadership would have any role in post-war Gaza. Gee, I can't imagine. What do you think? So one Arab official said Hamas's political wing should be included in the talks, if not in the future government. We need someone there who represents them to ensure that they're on board with this, the official said. If not, and they're not happy about it, we will have Fatah and Hamas all over again, the official said, referring to earlier confrontations between the two Palestinian groups that ultimately led to Hamas's election as the governing power in Gaza. But if they can achieve 2 years of stability and prosperity under a revitalized government, the official said, no one will choose Hamas at the ballot spot. So that's just a lie, right? This is just a total lie. Hamas has always led in the West Bank, in Judea and Samaria, and in Gaza. And in fact, they've always led, or in recent years, they've led by a far wider margin in Judea and Samaria than they have in Gaza, maybe because people don't live under the Hamas jackboot in Judea and Samaria. But whatever the case, prosperity has never managed to make a dent in the Palestinians' quest for the annihilation of Israel, because that's all they have as a society. And that's why 94%, I'm just going to go back to that statistic, they said to Birzeit researchers that they've never been more proud of being Palestinians than they have been since October 7th, right? Genocide does it for them. Why? Because their society is organized around that principle. So that's what the Americans are planning for Israel. They want within just a few weeks to reach this comprehensive plan. They're going on the back of the hostages in order to force Israel into a strategic collapse. And here we'll get back to the part that I went over. So they're lining up their ducks. They're planning on gang raping Israel from a diplomatic perspective at the Munich Security Conference that's going to be taking place this weekend. It says here, recent trips to Arab capitals by U.S. Secretary of State Anthony Blinken and visits to Washington by Qatar's Prime Minister and Jordan's King Abdullah II have focused on what Blinken on a stop last week in Doha called, quote, the substance and the sequence of all the steps needed to set a practical, time-bound, irreversible path to a Palestinian state living side by side in peace with Israel. It's coming ever more sharply into focus. So this is Blinken. He's locked on this target. This is what he wants, a Palestinian state. Now, why? Again, what's the urgency? It's not the hostages, right? The hostages, you don't need a Palestinian state. You need pliers, firmly connected to something on the Hamas leadership levels, bodies, right? And then you get the hostages out. That's how you get them out. You squeeze them till it hurts so bad that they let our hostages out. But no. What Blinken proposes is actually giving them a state. And then they're working in coordination with all of their friends. So the circle of support for a firm plan extends beyond the small group of those working on it directly. British Foreign Secretary David Cameron has expressed public interest in early recognition of a Palestinian state. The European Union is reaching out to see how we can work together to have a larger plan that actually focuses on getting to the end of the conflict, says Sven Koopmans, the EU Special Representative for the Middle East peace process. That's an actual peace process that wants to get an independent, fully recognized Palestinian state and a secure Israel, fully integrated into the region. Is that feasible? It's extremely difficult, but in the absence of any other plan, we are interested in pursuing this. Blah, blah, blah. So they're bringing in Britain and they're bringing in the European Union. And incidentally, Britain followed America and levied sanctions on Israelis who live in Judea and Samaria who have committed no crimes. And now the EU, the German foreign minister said on Thursday morning that Germany thinks that the EU should also apply sanctions to Israelis for being, shepherds in Judea and Samaria and making it hard for the Palestinians to seize state land in those areas, because that's not allowed, because a state is not supposed to be Israel. It's supposed to be a Palestinian terror state. So the EU also wants to criminalize Israelis who live in Judea and Samaria, and they're going along with the British. The Americans started it, the British and the French followed, and now we're expecting the EU to join as well. So everybody's coming on board. They're going to talk about it at Munich all together. And what is it that the Americans want to do? So the Americans want to recognize this Palestinian state. And here we have to talk for a second about what that means. So the United States is a signatory on what are called the Oslo Agreements. Those are the agreements that Israel negotiated with the PLO throughout the 1990s, beginning in 1993 with the Declaration of Principles that set out the framework for an Israeli-Palestinian peace, right? And the Americans were a signatory to that. They're a sponsor of the Oslo Accords, of the Oslo Agreements. And in all of the agreements, the firm principle was that the final status of relations between Israel and the Palestinians would be determined only through bilateral negotiations, so that the only way for the Palestinians under the Oslo formula to achieve statehood is by coming to a negotiated agreement with Israel, coming to a negotiated peace with Israel. And in the absence of that, right, any effort by the Palestinians to go outside of the framework of bilateral negotiations to establish a peace would constitute a material breach of the Oslo agreements, which means that they would be null and void. And the United States, and so it's true that lots of countries have recognized Palestine. They started doing it in the 1970s. This is true. However, the United States is a signatory to the Oslo Agreement. So if the United States were to be in material breach of the Oslo Accords and effectively render them null and void, what is it saying? It's saying that it's not even thinking about taking into consideration any of Israel's security needs, because the idea of a bilaterally negotiated peace is that both sides are able to secure their vital interests in the course of negotiations. But here we see what the United States wants to do is establish an interim Palestinian government in which Hamas will be the controlling factor, to block Israel from destroying Hamas's regime in Gaza by maintaining Hamas's control of the international border with Egypt, and blocking Israel from reaching strategic victory by eradicating the remaining Hamas battalions that are located in Rafah or Rafah, and therefore just make Israel lose. So you want a strategic defeat for Israel after October 7th, and you want October 7th to be the gateway for the establishment of a Palestinian state. So what you're saying is that Palestinian Independence Day is October 7th, that you want to reward genocide with statehood. And not only statehood, but a state that will ensure, right, the completion of the goal of genocide against the Jews, because you want them to control Judea and Samaria, and you want them to control Jerusalem. And if they do all of these things, and that means that Israel ceases to exist, because what we saw on October 7th would be a dim, small, an insignificant incident in comparison to what would await Israel if the United States gets their way. So when I started this deposition on this Washington Post article by saying that the Washington Post article represents a unilateral abrogation of the U.S. alliance with Israel, I meant it. Because if the United States policy right now is to force a Palestinian state down Israel's throat and force Israel and not even include Israel in the negotiation, much less make it the determining factor in its own future, which would be very much dictated by whether or not there's a Palestinian state. And to do this, right, in contempt of the position of over 80% of Israelis, then what the United States is saying is that they consider Israel to be the biggest problem. We're the elephant in the room. It's not Netanyahu and his hardline government. It is the people of Israel that we're talking about here. And what the U.S. proposes to do is establish a terrorist state led by the people who engaged in acts of genocide and those who supported them, right? In response to those acts of genocide, it's as if, you did World War II in reverse. First, you got Auschwitz and the ghetto, and then you got the ghettos, and then at the end of the war, the final settlement of World War II would be Munich, because that's essentially what the United States is saying here. Start with Auschwitz, right? And then we'll give you the Rhineland and we'll give you Czechoslovakia. And, without Czechoslovakia, there was no defense. So that's what we're seeing now. This is a shocking development, and we all have to be not only aware of it, but it's very necessary for Israel to make clear that this simply cannot stand, and it's very important that Israel's friends in the United States make clear that this cannot stand. Whether you support a Palestinian state, I don't know why you would, or not, that Palestinian state that the United States wants to establish has to be established through a negotiated peace between Israel and the Palestinians, not by diplomatic fiat, by Secretary of State or a president that are rushing to appease Hamas supporters in Dearborn, Michigan. Anyway, I wanted to make sure that we got this out as quickly as possible because it's hot off the presses, and it's very important that we all understand this new and very startling and alarming development. Anyway, take care, have a great weekend, and I'll talk to you again next week.